In this video, I am going to speak about the historical development of broadcast technology and how this technological change has impacted the TV industry in regards to production, distribution, and access. Helical scan is a process in which a magnetic signal is put through a tape, typically a mini DV tape, VHS, or an audio cassette. This tape then stores the information in such a way which allows a player to translate the magnetic signal into audio and video signals. This can then be turned into a picture. Originally, helical scan was created in the 1950s with the sole purpose of recording audio, but over time it evolved to include audio and video. Helical scan wasn't widely adopted until the 80s, up until the digital revolution in the 2000s. Doctor Who used this process from 1986 with its classic series, but also when it revived its series in 2005. There were many reasons why the use of helical scan became popular. Compared to film, it was a lot cheaper, more lightweight, more sturdy, and it was smaller, which meant it was easier to carry around than a typical film camera. It could also be used multiple times, unlike film, which could only be used once. However, helical scan did have its drawbacks. Even though it could be used multiple times, it still had a limited lifespan, and it began to deteriorate after so many uses. Also, the DV tapes could not hold as much information as modern-day drives. Therefore, the quality was really bad. During this time, many television sets broadcast in 567i. This means that the lack of quality wasn't as noticeable to the audience. In the present day, however, most televisions are capable of broadcasting in 1080p or even 4K. This means the horrendous quality of helical scan tapes is extremely obvious to a modern audience. This can be seen when you watch the 2005 series of Doctor Who. You can see in this season of Doctor Who that the saturation is not quite right and there isn't any sharpness or clear definition. In regards to digital technology, by the 1980s, technology had already progressed to a decent point. Despite this, there wasn't yet the ability to record digitally, as the write speed of the cards wasn't fast enough to write audio and visuals, but also keep a good enough quality for television. By the mid-2000s, technology had advanced enough that it was able to record both audio and visuals at HD quality, but also quickly, 40 megabytes per second. This was made possible by HD-era drive recordings, where you could record straight to the drive. For example, CF cards, SSD cards, and SD cards. Compared to helical scan tapes, digital drives are much more reliable, as they are less likely to break than tapes or film, and can capture moving images in much better quality. On top of this, media and digital drives can be deleted, and the drives can be formatted and used an almost unlimited number of times, and they shouldn't start to deteriorate unlike helical scan tapes. There have been many technological developments in television production since the first broadcast signal in 1895 by Guglielmo Marconi. All previous long-range communications had to be done through wired lines such as telephone lines. Therefore, this was the first form of wireless communication. To put into perspective, this was during the Victorian Britain era, so it was way before its time. By 1905, new technology allowed for the development and broadcast of radio talk and music broadcasts, and by 1920 there was wide-range commercial radio broadcasting. Guglielmo Marconi became a key founder of the BBC in 1922, aka the British Broadcasting Corporation. All of the first broadcasts for the BBC were set up entirely with Marconi's kit. BBC's technology changed the way in which people consume news and increased the speed that news was able to spread. For the first time in history, there was the ability to spread news instantly over the entire nation. This would have allowed for instant national communication during World War II. The BBC Royal Charter was an agreement signed by the BBC and King George V in 1926. The Royal Charter and agreement set out 5 public purposes for the BBC. One of these agreements was to provide impartial news and information to help people understand and engage with the world around them. Providing impartial news became really difficult to enforce during World War II. A year after the BBC Royal Charter was created, in 1927, The first electronic television set was invented by 21-year-old Villiers Taylor Farnsworth. The system he created involved transforming moving images into code, which were then sent along radio waves to other devices. The first image Farnsworth was able to transmit with this method was just a simple line. Historically, he later transmitted a $sign when he was asked by a potential investor, "When are we going to see some dollars in this thing, Farnsworth?" It may be funny to note that television technology was so advanced that many people thought it was witchcraft. The nation was extremely slow to adopt the television. It had high costs, took a lot of living space, no one really knew what to do with TV, and all they were doing in early broadcasts was radio, but with a picture. Not many people in the post-war society could, or wanted to, fork out a lot of money for something that practically did the same job as the radio. Back at the start of the Second World War in 1939, the government thought that the BBC would be great use as propaganda for the war. However, the BBC tried to keep their promise to the King that they wouldn't be used to brainwash the public. Unfortunately for the BBC, 3 years after the creation of their visual content, the start of the war caused the BBC to reduce all of their broadcasts down to just radio content. This was because most of their workforce was off fighting in the war, and their technology was so expensive that people wouldn't fund the BBC because they were focusing on the war effort instead. From 1939 until 1949, the world was witness to one of the worst wars yet, World War II. This was in an age of new technology, which allowed for radios for soldiers. This included the use of Morse code in radio signals in order to send secret messages to illegal radios in occupied countries, as well as radio signals for Nazi bombers. The BBC relaunched its only channel straight after the end of the war in 1945. And then, in 1946, the mandatory television licence was introduced in order to fund the BBC. However, the BBC met its match on 22nd September 1955, when ITV entered the broadcasting world. ITV is short for Independent Television, as for the first time in the UK, consumers had a chance to choose which channel they could watch. Initially, ITV was only broadcasted in London, but over time it began to expand its broadcasts. Developments in technology such as the popularization of the Steinbeck and the KEM, Keller Electromechanic, allowed for more sophisticated genres such as sci-fi to start popping up. Shows such as The Quatermass Experiment, A for Andromeda, and of course Doctor Who, were some of the first sophisticated science fiction programs to come out of the 50s and 60s. Originally, TV dramas could only be seen live. This meant that stories couldn't last over more than one episode. Stories would not span over the course of a series, and characters would most likely stay the same from the beginning to the end, with little to no character progression. This is because producers were aware that audiences might miss the next episode. This would then confuse consumers if series were all of a sudden completely different when they watched the next episode. Walter Bruch invented the power line during the 1960s at Telefunken, a German radio and television company. PAL stands for Phase Alternate Line, and it is the standard video quality used in Britain. One of these pictures are made up of 625 lines, which are displayed at 25 frames per second. American broadcasts follow a slightly different standard, NTSC. NTSC stands for the National Television Standards Committee. This group created both the black and white and color television systems in America. A picture that uses the NTSC system will be made up of 525 lines and is displayed at 29.97 frames per second, more commonly known as 30 frames per second. 1960 was the birth of one of the first soap operas, Coronation Street. Coronation Street revolutionized the way in which TV shows were created. There were no longer episode-long stories. Stories now spanned across several episodes, and some were even weeks long. ITV were able to rake in the revenue by using this format. They used cliffhangers and the longevity of storylines in order to entice the audience to return for future episodes. In order to try and keep up with the competition, the BBC created its second channel, BBC Two. The content from this new channel would be close to that of the original. However, it would be produced for a more specialised audience. Adding a second channel meant that the BBC could further justify the implementation of the TV licence and be more creative with what they produce. Thanks to the increased competition between the BBC and ITV, technology was advancing rapidly as the two broadcasters tried to outdo each other. This soon led to the advancement of colour television as well as the development of live TV broadcasts. With sports holding some of the biggest events in Britain, the BBC decided that would be their next goal. Britain's first colour television broadcast was the Wimbledon Tennis Championships in 1967, which was broadcast on BBC Two. Nearly every BBC Two programme was broadcast in colour by mid-1968. Colour television was extended to BBC One and ITV on 15th of November 1969. After this time, all channels began to regularly broadcast in colour. On the 1st of August 1981, American audiences were witness to the first ever 24-hour music television channel. This was aptly named MTV. Suitably, MTV's first broadcast was "Video Killed the Radio Star" by the Bugles. This was a large indication of how MTV would begin to rule over the broadcasting world. Initially, the channel struggled with low viewing figures. It wasn't until 2 years later when the channel expanded its market to include more variety of artists such as Prince and Michael Jackson. MTV soon surpassed the radio in regards to viewership, and by the late 80s, approximately 25% of teens watched MTV. Blockbuster was formed in 1985 after the owner, David Cook, saw an increase in the popularity of at-home videos and decided to create a video rental store based in America. In the beginning, the store gained popularity so quickly that by 1988 it had become America's leading video chain, and it soon began operating abroad as well. In 1997, Blockbuster's rival, Netflix, also launched in America. As Blockbuster rented DVD and VHS tapes via stores, and Netflix was just a mail-order DVD rental business, Netflix wasn't deemed as much of a threat to Blockbuster. In 1990, Sky launched their own channel, and it became the first company in Britain to charge a subscription fee, as well as using advertising revenue. BBC was funded solely by the TV license, and ITV by advertising revenue, so Sky was the first of its kind to make profits from multiple sources. After the peak of MTV in the mid-80s, viewership began to decline, and MTV decided to try and win back their audience by airing different shows. The switch from music videos began with the reality show, The Real World, which aired in 1992. The producers soon realized that the reality shows were more of a hit than their music videos. Therefore, from the mid-90s, music videos were dropped to only 3 hours of daily airtime. This was to make room for their more popular shows, such as The Osbournes and Pimp My Ride. The 1990s saw the popularization of reality TV shows and single-camera productions. Producers began to see that niche audiences could still be highly profitable. This was especially noticeable with children's television, which began to introduce live-action dramas such as Tracy Beaker and The Queen's Nose. In January 1995, BBC Worldwide Limited was formed from BBC Enterprises. Its purpose? To sell BBC broadcasts as well as other BBC merchandise abroad in order to increase the BBC's income. This allowed for channels such as BBC America to appear. This is where British BBC shows would be sold abroad to the BBC America. This happens with the modern Doctor Who series, which is broadcast on BBC America around the same time as the BBC in the UK. As well as important shows, American channels also export shows to other countries. Many American shows such as Friends and Game of Thrones are extremely popular over here in the UK. However, due to the different standard frame rates used in both countries, American shows can look weird when played on a British system. Therefore, British channels will edit American shows by cutting out a certain amount of frames, from 30 frames per second to the British standard of 25 frames per second. This ensures that British audiences are comfortable with the look of the shows. Broadband is a high-speed internet connection which can be installed in individuals' homes. In 2001, the first UK broadband was installed in Essex for a testing period. After this proved successful, broadband was rolled out to more areas of the UK. The problem broadband providers found in the UK is that people were sceptical about moving from dial-up to a broadband connection. This showed in the fact that only 9% of the UK population was using broadband, compared to 30% in Germany and 40% in Sweden. Slowly, British consumers began to warm up to the idea of broadband, and by 2009, 50% of the British population had access to broadband in their own homes. Around the same time, broadband connections became robust enough to allow consumers to stream and watch videos. This massively changed the habits of British audiences. Eventually, by the 2010s, MTV stopped airing music videos altogether. This was thanks to the advancements in technology, which meant that it was much easier for audiences to find a music video on YouTube, where they can search for a specific video. whereas on MTV they would have to wait for that video to air. On October 17, 2007, the digital switchover began in the UK, and it was rolled out region by region until the switchover was complete in 2012. Instead of using radio signals like analog television, digital TV uses a digital signal in order to transmit programs. These digital signals can be compressed much more efficiently than radio signals, which means they use less bandwidth and therefore can transmit better image quality than its analog predecessor. Blockbuster attempted various projects in order to keep customers, such as online DVD rental services and rental kiosks. However, in 2007, Netflix expanded its services by launching an online streaming service. This proved to be a popular hit with consumers. Blockbuster tried to replicate this years later in 2011, but this was too late, and the business model completely flopped. This is because consumers had already moved over to streaming services such as Netflix and Amazon Video. Thanks to the digital switchover, in 2008, the Xbox 360 was the first device to allow Netflix to be streamed from its device. PlayStation 3 followed suit in the following year, and by 2013, Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix, confirmed that the PlayStation 3 was the largest TV-connected platform in regards to Netflix viewings. Eventually, Blockbuster died out in 2013. Many say this is because Blockbuster didn't utilize technology quite as quickly or in the same way as other American streaming giants. Where some television companies have failed, the creation of broadband and the increase of its durability and speed has allowed for many streaming services such as Netflix and Amazon Prime to thrive in an environment where watching TV on the go is a huge part of society. Since 2012, the Doctor Who team has been using the BAFTA Albert website to measure its carbon footprint. The BAFTA's Albert measures how badly a TV production affects the environment. In other words, it's a carbon calculator. Thanks to this, the 2017 Christmas special of Doctor Who received the Albert Sustainable Production credentials, which they proudly placed on their ending credits. Another reason this series was so sustainable is because it was made at the BBC Drama Studios at Rothlock in Cardiff. These studios became the first industrial building to qualify for the BREEAM Outstanding Award, and in 2012 they also had the highest BREEAM rating for an industrial building in the UK. BREEAM is a scheme that provides assessments and certifications of the sustainability of buildings, communities and infrastructure projects. The BBC Drama Studios received this award thanks to a variety of reasons. When the building was constructed, the team were able to reroute 96% of the site waste away from landfill. They also added solar panels to the building and allowed for rainwater harvesting, which saves the building approximately 2.4 million litres of water a year. On top of this, 60% of the lighting is low energy, with Kino flow lamps replacing tungstens and compact fluorescent tubes replacing space lights. During production, rechargeable batteries are used where possible by the sound department. Scripts are emailed, and only if needed they'll be printed on A5 paper instead of A4. Dropbox file sharing is used, and the production team are using mugs and refillable water bottles to cut back on plastic. On top of this, the maximum amount of waste is recycled through Biffa, the BBC's waste company, and also Dress, who repurpose set materials for offices and events. During 2016, the Doctor Who team needed to fly out to Bulgaria for a Christmas special. In order to keep this episode as sustainable as possible, they hired most of the crew and equipment locally and only flew out a small UK team with cameras. These moves saved approximately 35 tons of carbon emissions and £12,500 on flights, accommodation and other transport. For UK-based productions, the crew tried to car share where possible, choose low carbon emission cars, and many members tried to travel by train or cycle or walk instead of drive to work. Doctor Who is a British science fiction television programme about a time traveller called the Doctor. It was originally broadcast on the BBC on 23rd November 1963. The classic series was broadcast from 1963 until 1989, with 7 different actors portraying the role of the Doctor. However, there was a 16-year gap when Michael Grade, the BBC One controller at the time, decided to cancel the show.
No, when I was controller of BBC One, I cancelled the show. I thought it was rubbish.
Luckily, the show was brought back to life by Russell T Davies, who revived the show in 2005 with Christopher Eccleston as the Doctor. There have been 5 Doctors in the revived series thus far, with there being 42 years between the premieres of the classic and revived series of the show. I thought it would be perfect to compare the technology between the series. The classic series of Doctor Who was initially broadcast in black and white between 1963 and 1969 with the first 2 Doctors, but once the 3rd Doctor, Jon Pertwee, was introduced in in 1970, colour television had become mainstream in the UK. Therefore, it was decided that the rest of the series was to be broadcast in colour. All of the revived series has been shot and broadcast in colour as well. 16mm film was used from 1963 until 1985, as this was the main form of media at the time. In 1983, the production team decided to switch to videotape for their interior shots. Videotape wasn't used for exterior shots until 1986 with season 23. Before this point, the equipment was big, difficult to move around. It had to be fed through big cables into big videotape machines, and the cameras also required a lot of light in order to shoot good images. This meant that although film was more expensive, initially it was actually cheaper to shoot with film for exterior shots. When episodes were made on videotape, they were recorded using the 405 line PAL system, which meant it was broadcast in 576i. Similarly, when the series was revived in 2005, videotape was still used along with the PAL system. However, the UK stopped transmitting in PAL in 2012 after the digital switchover. They now transmit in DVB-T2. This stands for Digital Video Broadcasting, Second Generation Terrestrial. The revived Doctor Who series stopped using videotape after season 4 and switched to digital cameras. This means that compared to the shoddy 576i quality of the classic series, the revived series can air in 1080p HD. In regards to cameras, the first 6 seasons of the classic Doctor Who were filmed with an EMI Type 203 image orthicon camera. This camera could only film in black and white, therefore, when the production team decided to start filming in colour, the cameras then changed to the BBC standard EMI 2001 television broadcast camera. This was then used until the classic Doctor Who ceased production. After the show's regeneration in 2005, a series of cameras have been used to capture the show. Sony Betacam cameras were used from season 1 until season 4. And then the Sony HDW F900 in season 5. Since season 6, the Doctor Who team has kept with the Arri Alexa XT, using the Alexa Mini as well for series 11. In order for season 11 of Doctor Who to be the most cinematic season yet, the cameras were used along with the Cooke and Angenieux anamorphic lenses. Usually these lenses would be used on high-budget films, so you can really see the increase in quality of the cinematography in season 11 compared to earlier seasons. From 1963 until 1969, the audio for Doctor Who was recorded in mono, monaural sound. This means that there was only one audio channel, which was created by a singular signal, one microphone. This means that even if there were multiple speakers, the same sound would output from each speaker. The production team decided to spice things up by switching to stereo sound systems for the final 2 years of the show, 1988 to 1989. Stereo systems would allow the team to use 2 or more microphones in order to output a different signal to each speaker. Using a stereo system means that the sound text could trick the audience into thinking the sound is coming from various directions and locations. However, stereo systems are much more expensive than mono systems, and the file sizes it creates are much larger than mono files. Once the show revived in 2005, the production began to use the Dolby Digital 5.1 sound mix, aka surround sound. These use 5 speakers along with a subwoofer to generate surrounding sound. Compared to stereo, which only sounds like it's going from side to side, surround sound is used to give the illusion that sound can be coming from any direction. The main advantage of this system is that it fully integrates the audience into the experience of the episode. However, this system does require 5 or more speakers, therefore not many households will be able to accommodate this system. During the classic era of Doctor Who, editors had to be creative in the ways in which they edited an episode. During this time, there wasn't a renowned video editing software. Instead, editors had to literally cut the film and splice it back together again. In order to create a lot of their special effects, the team used tricks such as double exposure. This involved masking off a section of the set in black and filming it for a short while. The film or videotape would then be rolled back through the camera, and the previous sequence would be masked over, and they would re-expose the new aspect of the scene to the film. This would often be used to make it seem like an actor was appearing into the shot. Later on in the series, the evolution of technology allowed for the use of CSO, colour separation overlay, or in other words, chroma key. This involves separating the background colour from one shot, and then overlaying the shot into another one in order to give it a new background. The key colour, aka the removable colour, was originally yellow in the early 1970s of Doctor Who, and then this changed to blue later on. These colours were used because they are not natural human skin tones, and therefore there was less chance of parts of the actors accidentally being replaced too. However, this process could only be done live, so any errors such as misalignment remained in the shot. This process also required the use of scene sync, which meant coordinating two cameras' movement to allow the CSO background and foreground shots to move in harmony. This meant that the use of CSO was quite a time-consuming process and would likely create a lot of errors. This contrasted majorly with the revived series of Doctor Who, which has used some of the top video editors of the modern day. This includes Apple Final Cut Pro 7 when the series first revived in 2005, and later switching to DaVinci and Final Cut Pro X not long after its release in 2011. Compared to the analog editing of its predecessor, the revised series majorly benefits from its editing process. Faster organization, mistakes can be undone, episodes can be virtually rewritten without having to reshoot, there can be better visual effects with the use of CGI, and so much more. In regards to the distribution and access of classic Who episodes, when the episodes first came out, they could only be seen as live on terrestrial television. Most episodes were aired on Saturday nights, as the show was seen as a family-friendly educational show. The only problem with this kind of distribution, however, is that audiences were likely to miss an episode if they had other commitments whilst the episode was airing. Therefore, later on, the studio decided to release many of the classic episodes on VHS so fans could catch up on missed episodes or collect the series if they so wished. These episodes were later re-released on DVD for modern-day audiences to watch on their DVD player. For a short while, many of the classic episodes were available on Netflix. However, these were taken down due to the lack of interest and the fact that many of the episodes are completely lost, which means they cannot be shown. On the other hand, the revived series has a whole array of distribution methods and ways for audiences to access episodes. Similarly to the classic era, the revived era also aired as live on terrestrial television. However, audiences could also access the episode live or afterwards on the BBC iPlayer app on any compatible device such as phone, tablet, laptop. This meant that even if audiences were unavailable during the live viewing, they can still catch up on the episode afterwards or even whilst they were on the go. They don't need a television set. Most of the revived era is also available to watch on Netflix on most devices. The small drawbacks of accessing the episodes on Netflix are that audiences have to pay a monthly fee to access the site, and Netflix doesn't have the up-to-date series. Audiences can be waiting a couple of years before the new series appears on Netflix. Likewise, to Classic Who, the revived series also gets a DVD release. These are released as episodes are released, and they can be purchased by the official BBC merchandise store. Even though these series were years apart, there are many similarities, but also many differences. But still to this day, they have a massive fan base.